I was 70 years old the first time I heard it said out loud in my own living room. Not the whispers from neighbors, not the giggles from children at the playground, not even the side glances from relatives at weddings. No, this time it was right there, between the clinking of silver spoons against porcelain cups and the hum of the ceiling fan that had been running since morning. "He's not really ours, you know." The word slipped from my sister-in-law's mouth like a piece of fruit gone rotten. She didn't say it to me. She said it to the woman next to her, as though I wasn't even in the room. As though my boy, my son, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with his cousins, wasn't real enough to hear the weight of those words pressing against his back. I froze in my chair. The old wood beneath me creaked like it, too, had something to say but held itself back. My fingers tightened around the armrest, and for a moment I wanted to stand, to tell them to hush, to remind them that love doesn't come from blood. It comes from something deeper, something chosen. But I didn't. I sat there as I had so many times before, with the ache of silence filling my chest. You see, I am a father of both chance and choice. My son came to me not through the wailing cries of delivery, but through the quiet paperwork of adoption. I remember the day as clearly as yesterday, the way his tiny hand gripped my thumb, the way his dark eyes searched mine like he already knew I was going to be his. And in that instant I made a vow: he would never know the difference between born to me and brought to me. He was mine. End of story. But families don't always honor vows. That Sunday afternoon, our living room was crowded with laughter, steaming casseroles, and the smell of overcooked ham. My cousins had gathered, the kind of gathering where old stories are retold like broken records and children are paraded around like proof of a family tree that stretches too high. My boy, he was 14 then, laughed too, but I noticed the way his smile curled only halfway, like he had learned that joy needed to be rationed in certain rooms. His shoulders hunched a little, the way a man does when he knows the world might take a swing at him at any moment. The whispers followed him like shadows, and me. I sat in that armchair, pretending to listen to some uncle ramble about politics, while my ears burned with the sound of that single sentence still echoing. "He's not really ours." It's funny. Sometimes the deepest cuts don't come from strangers, but from the ones who share your name. That night, after everyone left, I found my boy in his room, sketching in that old notebook I had given him 2 Christmases back. He didn't look up when I stepped in. I asked him if he'd had fun. He shrugged. I asked him what he was drawing. He said, "Just something to remember." I leaned over and saw what it was. It wasn't a superhero or a dream car or some faraway city like he usually drew. No, this time he had drawn a tree, a family tree, and there at the center of the trunk he had written one word in block letters, heavy and firm. Dad. Not my name, just that word, Dad. And I swear to you, my eyes burned hotter than any fire I've ever known. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed beside my wife, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the things people say when they think it doesn't matter, the poison of whispers, the way they settle into the skin of a boy who didn't ask for any of it. I thought of how many times he must have heard it before I finally caught on, how many times he smiled through it, how many times he swallowed it whole, like medicine that didn't heal but only hurt. It was in that moment I realized something. This wasn't just about me proving he was my son. It was about him proving to the world, and maybe even to himself, that he belonged, that he carried not only my name but my heart. And that's the story I want to tell you here. Because what happened after, what this boy did when the weight of scandal came crashing down on all of us, that is something none of those whisperers could have predicted. That's when the world learned what I already knew, that sometimes the ones we choose are the ones who save us. But before I tell you how my son saved the family name, I need you to walk with me through the beginning. The living rooms, the sideways glances, the long nights where silence spoke louder than words. Only then will you understand the power of what he did. So stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this isn't just my story. It might be yours too. And I promise, by the time you reach the end, you'll see that blood may define where we come from, but love defines who we are. The church bells had a way of ringing straight through my bones. They weren't just sounds, they were memories cast into the air of weddings I'd stood through, of funerals I'd survived, of countless Sundays when faith seemed like the only steady thing I had left. But that morning the bells carried something else. They carried eyes. You see, people don't have to say a word to make you feel small. A stare will do it just fine. We walked in together, me, my wife, and my son. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn for years, a little tighter now at the shoulders, the threads loosening at the cuffs. My wife carried her leather-bound Bible, the one her mother had given her. And my boy, he walked half a step behind us, wearing a shirt I had ironed myself, his collar crisp, his shoes polished so bright I thought maybe they could blind out the stairs. They didn't. From the moment we stepped through those oak doors, the room shifted. Conversations dipped. Smiles narrowed. Heads turned ever so slightly. The air smelled of incense and floor polish, but underneath it smelled of judgment. I try to keep my eyes forward, but it's hard not to notice when people notice. The whispers rustled like pages being turned in unison. That's the adopted one. Bless their hearts, they took him in. Doesn't look a bit like his father, does he? I wanted to grab each word out of the air, crush it in my hand and scatter it like dust, but I couldn't. Words, once spoken, even whispers, have a way of planting themselves where you least want them. My son pretended not to hear. He slid into the pew beside me, straight-backed, his eyes fixed on the altar. But I knew the difference between silence and strength. Silence is what you hold when you have no other choice. Strength is what you show when you do. That morning he was holding silence. The pastor began his sermon. I wish I could tell you what it was about, but truthfully I couldn't focus. My ears throbbed with the phantom of every whisper. I kept sneaking glances at my boy, watching his jaw tighten, his fists unclench and clench again on his knees. And then something happened. Midway through the sermon, the pastor spoke of family. A family, he said, is not just bloodlines. It is where love abides, where sacrifice is made, where forgiveness grows. For a second, I swore he looked straight at us. I wondered if he meant it for us or for them. My son's shoulders eased just a fraction. His eyes lifted, and I saw a flicker like a spark of light through glass. He leaned toward me slightly and whispered, "He's right, Dad." 2 words, but they filled me with something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. Yet even as the service ended, the stares lingered. At the exit, when people shook hands with the pastor, I overheard another jab disguised as kindness. "God bless you for taking him in." Taking him in. As though he were some stray dog found in an alley. As though he were charity, not family. I shook the man's hand firmly, smiled with all the restraint I had left, and replied, "God bless me," when he gave him to me. The man blinked, his smile faltering. My son heard it, and for the first time that morning he smiled. A real smile, not the rationed one. We walked out into the sunlight. The sky was too bright, the pavement too hot, but my chest felt lighter somehow. Maybe it was the sermon. Maybe it was the way my son had said those 2 simple words. Or maybe it was just the realization that no matter how many stares followed us, as long as he looked at me and called me Dad, I was exactly where I was meant to be. But that Sunday was only the beginning. Because stares have a way of multiplying, of following you beyond the walls of a church, beyond the sidewalks of your neighborhood, beyond the quiet corners of your own home. And soon, those stares would turn into accusations, and those accusations into a storm so fierce that only one person, the very one they whispered about, would be brave enough to stand against it. And I'll never forget the day I realized. The boy they pitied was the man who would save us all. It was a Thursday afternoon, one of those late spring days when the sun hangs low but refuses to soften. The air smelled of cut grass and warm asphalt. I had finished my shift at the hardware store early, so instead of heading straight home, I drove past the school. I told myself it was habit, that sometimes a father just likes to see where his boy spends his days. But the truth was simpler and heavier. I worried about him. He was 15 then, caught in that fragile place between boyhood and manhood, a place where every stare cuts deeper and every laugh lasts longer than it should. I parked across the street near the chain-link fence that wrapped around the schoolyard. The kids were spilling out, loud, backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders. I scanned for my son and then I saw him, standing off to the side near the old oak tree at the far end of the yard. He wasn't alone. 3 boys circled him. Taller, louder, the kind of kids who carried arrogance like a badge. One of them jabbed a finger at my boy's chest. I couldn't hear the words, not from where I sat, but I didn't need to. The rhythm of cruelty is always the same. Lean in, smirk, laugh, shove, repeat. My son didn't push back, he didn't shout. He just stood there, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack, his chin tilted slightly upward, his jaw tight. I knew that look. It was the same look he wore in church, the same look at family gatherings, the look of someone swallowing pain whole so no one could see him chew it. And then it happened. One of the boys said something. I saw the way my son's face flickered, the way his shoulders tensed. It had to be about me, about him being not really mine. That was their favorite weapon, the word adopted twisted into a blade. The shove came next. My boy staggered back, hit the tree trunk with a dull thud. My heart leapt into my throat. Every instinct in me screamed to run across that street, to tear through the gate, to pull those boys off him and tell the whole world that this was my son, my blood or not. But I didn't move. I stayed in the car, hands gripping the wheel so hard I thought it might crack, because part of me knew if I fought this battle for him, he would never learn how to fight it for himself. And so I watched. The boys laughed and walked away, tossing their insults over their shoulders like scraps to a dog. My son didn't chase them. He didn't shout back. He just stood there alone, his hand pressed lightly against the bark of the tree. When he finally started walking home, I let him get ahead before pulling out. I drove slowly, trailing him at a distance as though I were his shadow. At dinner that night, he didn't mention it. He ate quietly, answered questions with one-word replies. My wife didn't press him. She had learned the same thing I had. Sometimes silence is its own language. Later, when I passed by his room, I saw him sitting at his desk, the lamplight spilling across his face. He was writing in that notebook again. He always wrote after days like that. I never asked what he put down on those pages, but I liked to think he was building a world where the stares and whispers couldn't reach him. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, watching him. He looked up once, caught me staring, and smiled faintly. Not the smile of a boy who had been beaten down, but the smile of someone who had chosen, once again, silence over surrender. And in that moment, I realized something. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it doesn't even speak. Sometimes it's nothing more than standing tall when the world tries to bend you. My boy had that strength. I saw it that afternoon by the oak tree. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that the same quiet strength that held him up in that schoolyard would one day hold up our entire family. That the boy who said nothing when others laughed would be the man who spoke when no one else dared. And when he finally broke his silence, it wouldn't just change us. It would save us. If there is one thing you should know about family reunions, it's this. They are not just about food or photographs. They are battlegrounds, dressed in tablecloths and polite laughter. Ours was held that summer in my cousin's backyard, a wide green space dotted with folding chairs and plastic tables, the kind of place where children chased one another between the grills, while adults debated sports and politics with paper cups in their hands. The air smelled of charcoal and sunscreen. My wife and I arrived with a potato salad she'd made the night before. My son carried it proudly, cradling the glass bowl like it was a treasure. He was 16 then, taller, his shoulders filling out, his face no longer the round softness of a boy but not yet the angles of a man. He had grown into himself, though I suspected the whispers had grown right along with him. The greetings started warmly enough, handshakes, hugs, pats on the back, but warmth can be thin like a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I noticed it quickly, the way relatives glanced at my son, the way they measured his presence. He wasn't the mirror of my features, wasn't the echo of our bloodline, and to them that meant he didn't quite belong. When it came time for the family photograph, the grand tradition at every reunion, I saw it unfold as though in slow motion. The cousins gathered, uncles and aunts arranged themselves, grandparents settled into chairs. My boy lingered at the edge, waiting for someone to wave him in. No one did. I started to call out, but the photographer, a distant cousin with a new camera, was already counting down. 3, 2. And just like that, the shutter snapped, sealing an image of a family that had left my son standing on the grass, a smile frozen on his face that wasn't quite a smile. He didn't protest. He didn't sulk. He just stepped back, hands in his pockets as though the exclusion were nothing new. But I saw it. I saw the way his shoulders dipped ever so slightly, the way his eyes darted to the ground. The photograph continued without him, different groups posing, laughter ringing out, arms slung over shoulders. And each time my boy stood aside, a quiet figure in the shade of the oak tree, the same one that had been his silent witness at school. I walked over to him. "You should be in those pictures," I said softly. He shrugged. "It's okay, Dad, but it wasn't okay. It had never been okay." I wanted to march back, to demand another photograph, to tell them all that family is not measured in resemblance but in resilience, not in blood but in bond. But again, I held my tongue, because sometimes words tossed in anger fall on deaf ears, and I wanted mine to reach further than that. Later, when the sun dipped and the tables filled with dessert, I found him sitting alone with a plate of pie he hadn't touched. I sat beside him. "You know," I said, "when I was your age, I hated photographs. Couldn't stand the way my hair always looked, the way I never knew where to put my hands." He smiled faintly. "At least you were in them." That cut deeper than any whisper. I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me. A photograph is just paper. But what you've given me, what you are to me, that's carved in stone. Do you understand?" He looked at me then, his eyes searching, as though he wanted to believe it but wasn't sure if the world would let him. That night after we drove home, I printed a picture from my old camera. It wasn't the official family photo. It was one I had taken when no one was watching. My boy standing in the shade, the light catching his face just right, his smile small but real. I framed it, set it on the mantel, and for years it was the photograph I loved most, because it wasn't about who stood beside him. It was about him and the quiet strength that would one day stand for us all. What I didn't know then was that the same family who left him out of a picture would soon find themselves clinging to him in the harshest spotlight imaginable. And when that moment came, he would not stand at the edge. He would stand at the center. And no one, no whisper, no stare, no photograph could erase him again. If you ask most fathers about their children, they'll rattle off accomplishments like grocery lists, grades, trophies, scholarships, careers. Proof that their seed grew tall and straight. I never had much of that to share at barbecues or church gatherings. My son didn't bring home ribbons for track meets. He wasn't captain of the football team, and he sure didn't care much for small-town bragging rights. He was quieter, softer in the ways that mattered, sharper in the ways few cared to notice. But let me tell you a secret. My pride in him was not loud, but it was endless. It wasn't the kind of pride you paste on Christmas cards. It was the kind you carried quietly, like a flame in your chest, steady and warm. I remember one evening in particular. The house was still, my wife asleep, the clock ticking like a metronome against the walls. I passed by his room and saw the glow of his desk lamp spilling onto the hallway carpet. I peeked in. He was bent over a sheet of paper, pencil moving quick and sure. I thought he was doing homework, but when I leaned closer, I saw what he was sketching. Not superheroes this time, not cars or cities. He was drawing the courthouse downtown. Every detail was there. The tall white columns, the chipped steps, the iron lampposts that stood like guards at either side. Even the cracks in the pavement were etched with care. "Why the courthouse?" I asked softly. He looked up, startled, then smiled. "Because one day, Dad, I'm going to walk through those doors and stand where truth matters." I laughed lightly. "So you want to be a lawyer?" He shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe just someone who can speak when others can't." I didn't press him. I didn't need to. In that moment, I felt something settle in me, an understanding that while others might measure him against family bloodlines or schoolyard trophies, I would measure him against his heart. And by that measure, he had already won. Of course, I couldn't say this out loud, not to my cousins who still compared their children's salaries like trading cards, nor to the church ladies who loved to gossip about whose boy made varsity. No, my pride remained a secret. It showed in the way I lingered over his sketches when he wasn't looking. It showed in the way I told the hardware store clerk, "That boy of mine's got a mind sharper than any saw we sell here." It showed in the way my chest swelled when I overheard him defending a friend at school, his voice calm but unshakable. And maybe, just maybe, it showed in the way I watched him more closely than he ever knew, as though by memorizing every gesture, I could shield him from a world that refused to see what I saw. My son wasn't loud about who he was. He didn't fight for the spotlight. But in the quiet corners, in the sketches and the whispers, he was already building something bigger, something that one day the whole family, hell, the whole town, would have no choice but to see. And I kept that pride locked tight in my chest like a letter unsent until the day came when silence could no longer hold it. Because the world was about to break us, and it would be him, not me, not the so-called blood heirs, who would piece us back together. And when he did, my secret pride would no longer be mine alone. It would belong to everyone. You don't see a storm coming when the sky is blue. It sneaks up on you, builds behind the horizon while you're still sipping sweet tea on the porch, and by the time you notice the clouds, it's already too late. That's how it was for us. The storm that broke my family didn't arrive with lightning and thunder. It arrived with headlines. It started one morning when I found my wife sitting at the kitchen table, the newspaper trembling in her hands. She didn't look up as I entered. She just pointed to the page, her finger pressed so hard the ink smudged. There it was. Our family name, bold, unmissable, plastered across the front page of the local section. Financial misconduct, bribery, illegal contracts. Not against me, but against my eldest son, the one who had followed in the family business. He had taken over my brother's company years back, strutted around town in polished shoes and silk ties, the kind of man people called a true heir. Now his face stared back at me from newsprint, his eyes hollow in the black and white photo. I remember the taste in my mouth, bitter, metallic, like pennies sucked dry. "Maybe it's a mistake," my wife whispered, "but mistakes don't make front pages." The phone started ringing before noon. Relatives, neighbors, reporters. The whole town smelled blood in the water, and our name had drawn the sharks. At dinner that night, the table was quiet. My eldest son didn't show up. Neither did his younger brother. Both had gone to ground, ducking calls, ducking responsibility. My wife pushed food around her plate. The silence between us was thicker than any soup. Only one voice broke it. "Dad," my youngest said, "my adopted son, what are we going to do?" I looked at him, startled. The question wasn't born of panic. It was steady, clear, like a man reaching for tools before fixing what was broken. I don't know," I admitted. The words tasted like failure, but he didn't flinch. "Then let me help." The storm grew worse the following days. More articles, investigations launched, reporters camping outside the gate, cameras flashing, our once proud name dragged through mud. The whispers that had haunted my son for years now turned toward all of us. "They're crooks." Knew that family wasn't as clean as they looked. Guess money matters more than morals. I saw it in people's eyes when I walked to church, when I bought groceries. The stares had followed my boy for years. Now they followed me. And here's the truth. My so-called blood son said nothing. They locked themselves away, too busy saving their own skins to defend the family. Not a word, not a statement, not even a glance my way. But my adopted son, the one who had stood at the edge of family photos, the one whispered about in pews, the one shoved against oak trees, he stood taller than them all. He gathered papers, dug through contracts, studied case law until midnight. I'd pass by his room and see him under the glow of that same desk lamp, pages scattered around him like fallen leaves. One night I stepped in. "Son," I said softly, "why are you doing this? It isn't your mess to clean up." He looked up, eyes sharp, jaw set. "It is, Dad. It's our name. It's our family. If I don't stand for it, who will?" I had no answer. The storm raged on. Reporters shouted at our door. Lawyers circled like vultures. Relatives distanced themselves, ashamed to be linked with us. The same people who had excluded my boy from photographs now excluded all of us from their tables. And still, through it all, my son worked. There was a night, God, I'll never forget it, when he stood before us in the living room, papers in hand, his voice steady as stone. "I've found inconsistencies," he said. "There are contracts that prove Dad's name was never tied to this, and I think I can show that the company's wrongdoing falls solely on others." I stared at him, my heart swelling with something I couldn't yet name: pride, relief, love, maybe all of them braided tight. The storm had broken us open, but in the ruins he stood. And for the first time I saw clearly what I had always known but never spoken. This boy, the one they whispered wasn't really ours, was the only one who had ever truly been. Courthouses always smell the same, like paper, dust, and a faint trace of fear. That morning, as I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the air felt thick, almost sacred, like we were entering a place where lies came to die, or at least where truth fought hard to survive. Reporters lined the steps outside, their cameras clicking like locusts. Questions were hurled into the air. Did your son take the money? Is the family name finished? Who's going to testify today? I kept my head down, my hand gripping my wife's arm. She trembled as though the stone steps themselves were shaking beneath her. Inside, the courtroom was already crowded. Family, townsfolk, strangers who had only ever known our name through whispers. They filled the benches, waiting to see if our reputation would sink or swim. At the front sat my eldest, pale, eyes hollow. The son who once carried our name like a crown now sat as though it weighed 100 pounds. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at anyone. But at my side, standing taller than I'd ever seen him, was my youngest, my adopted son. He wore a suit we had borrowed from a friend, a little too big at the shoulders, the sleeves brushing his wrists, but he carried it well. His jaw was set, his eyes steady, and when he glanced at me, I saw not fear but resolve. "Dad," he whispered, "don't worry, just trust me." And so the hearing began. The prosecution painted an ugly picture. Bribes exchanged, contracts manipulated, favors bought. They spoke as though the entire family tree was poisoned at its roots. Every word felt like a blade against our name. I clenched my fists, ready to crumble under the weight of it all, until I heard his voice. Objection. It rang clear, firm, echoing off the wooden walls. Heads turned. My son had risen, papers in hand, his figure sharp against the dull suits of seasoned lawyers. He wasn't there as an official attorney, he hadn't earned that title yet, but he had been granted the chance to present evidence on behalf of the family. Evidence no one else had bothered to find. With every page he flipped, with every word he spoke, the tide began to shift. "These contracts," he said, holding up copies for the judge, "show that the illegal dealings were signed after my father had already stepped away from the company. His name is not attached to these agreements. He is not culpable." He moved with calm precision, his voice steady even when the opposing counsel tried to rattle him. "Objection, he has no legal standing." One lawyer barked, but the judge leaned forward, curious. "Let him speak. Truth is no respecter of titles." The gallery stirred. I could feel eyes on me, some doubtful, some surprised. I wanted to shout, "Do you see now? Do you see who carries this family?" My boy pressed on. He laid out timelines, highlighted discrepancies, pointed to signatures that belonged not to me, not to him, but to others who had long hidden in shadows. With each revelation, I watched the color drain from the prosecution's face, and with each word my chest swelled until I thought it might burst. This wasn't the quiet boy shoved against oak trees, the silent figure left out of photographs. This was a man standing in the light, speaking truth into a room built for lies. When he finished, the silence was thunderous. The judge adjusted his glasses, studying the papers. Finally, he spoke. "These documents present a compelling case that the defendant, Mr. Robert Placeholder's surname, bears no direct involvement in the charges levied against the company." My wife gasped. I gripped the bench so tight my knuckles whitened. It wasn't an acquittal, not yet, but it was enough. Enough to shift the narrative, enough to plant seeds of doubt in soil that had only grown condemnation. And it was my son who had done it. As we left the courtroom, the reporters swarmed again, but their questions had changed. Who is that young man? Where did he learn to speak like that? Is he really adopted? Yes, I thought, he is, and he is mine. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where my wife once wept over headlines, I placed my hand over his. Son, I said, my voice thick, you did today what none of us could. He looked at me, eyes soft now, no longer burning with battle. I only did what you taught me, Dad. I shook my head. No, you did more. You gave our name back its honor. And in that quiet kitchen under the hum of the old fridge, I realized the storm had not ended, but its fiercest winds had been broken by the strength of the very boy they once said wasn't ours. And for the first time in months, I slept without fear. The morning after the hearing, I woke earlier than usual. Maybe it was habit. Age does that to you, robs you of long sleep. Or maybe it was the hum in my chest, the leftover thunder from what I had witnessed in that courtroom. The house was quiet. My wife still slept, her breathing soft, her arm draped across the quilt we'd had for years. But I couldn't lie still. I pulled on my slippers and walked to the porch. The newspaper was there, folded neatly in its plastic sleeve, as though it didn't hold the weight of my entire life inside. I bent slowly, knees cracking, and picked it up. I tore the plastic away and unfolded the pages, and there it was, our family name again. But this time it wasn't under scandal or corruption. It was under truth. Adopted son defends family in court. Evidence clears father's name. I read it once, then twice, my eyes blurring with something thicker than tears. The article went on to describe what the town had seen. A young man, not a lawyer by title but by heart, standing with papers in hand, dismantling the accusations piece by piece. They described his voice as calm but unyielding, his presentation as remarkably precise. They called him the unexpected hero of the trial. Unexpected. That word stuck like a thorn and a bomb all at once. Unexpected, because they had never expected him to matter. Unexpected, because they had never expected him to belong. Unexpected, because for years the whispers had said he wasn't truly ours. And now here he was, splashed across newsprint, holding up not just my name but theirs too, saving the very family that had once kept him at arm's length. By the time my wife shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes, I was already on my third read. "What's wrong?" she asked quickly, fear rising in her voice. "Nothing's wrong," I said, handing her the paper. My voice cracked. "Everything's right." She read in silence, her lips parting as though she could breathe easier with every line. Finally, she pressed the page to her chest. God bless that boy. The phone rang again that morning, but this time it wasn't vultures circling. It was family, those same cousins and uncles who had once whispered about the adopted one. Their voices now carried something else, awe. I saw the paper. Didn't know he had it in him. "You must be proud." Proud. They said it like it was new, like it was something I had just discovered yesterday in the courtroom. But I had been proud long before. I had been proud in the silence, in the sketches, in the notebooks and late-night whispers. I had carried that pride like a secret flame. Now the world saw it. That Sunday at church the stares were different, not the same sharp glances of pity or scorn. No, these stares carried curiosity, even respect. People leaned in to shake his hand. Mothers patted his shoulder. Fathers asked what college he planned to attend. And my boy, he smiled politely, nodded, answered softly. He didn't boast, he didn't gloat, he just carried himself with the same quiet grace that had been his shield for years. After service, as we walked out under the bright sun, I leaned close to him. "You notice the difference?" He smirked faintly. "They're looking at me now, Dad, but they don't really see me, not yet." That answer stopped me because he was right. Respect born of headlines is shallow. It blows in with the ink and blows out with the next scandal. But I also knew this. He didn't need their full sight anymore. He had already proven himself in the place that mattered most, in my eyes, in my wife's eyes, and in the truth of his own heart. That night, after the house had quieted again, I clipped the headline and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. I wanted it there, not because I needed proof of what he had done, but because I wanted to remember the sound of his voice in that courtroom, steady, strong, mine. The storm had not fully passed. More hearings were to come, more questions, more shadows. But the headline told the world what I already knew. My son was the one holding us together. And for the first time, I didn't care who whispered otherwise. The house always felt heavier after days like that, days when the world had clawed its way into our walls, leaving behind headlines, whispers, and the ache of being seen for all the wrong reasons. But that night was different. The trial had given us something we hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months: air. Not relief, not victory yet, but air enough to breathe again. My wife had gone to bed early, exhaustion pulling her under like a tide. The house was quiet, except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood settling into itself. I wandered into the living room. The lamp on the end table cast a soft glow, catching the dust that floated like tiny ghosts in the air. That's where I found him, my son sitting on the couch, still in his shirt and tie, though the knot was loosened and his sleeves rolled up. His notebook lay open on his lap, though the pencil in his hand wasn't moving. "You should be asleep," I said gently. He looked up, smiled faintly. "Could say the same to you, Dad." I lowered myself into the chair across from him. My knees cracked in protest, but I ignored them. For a moment we just sat there in the quiet. Finally I asked, "What are you writing?" He glanced at the notebook, then closed it. "Just trying to make sense of today." And he exhaled slowly, leaned back. It felt big, bigger than me, but also like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I studied him, the way the lamplight traced the lines of his face, the boyhood still clinging faintly at the edges, the manhood already carving its place. "Son," I said, my voice catching, "do you know what you did in that courtroom?" He shrugged. "I just spoke the truth." "No," I said firmly. "You carried us. You lifted this whole family when no one else could. Your brothers, my blood sons, they hid. But you stood." He didn't look away. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, steady, unflinching. "Because you taught me, Dad. You always said silence can protect you, but sometimes speaking is the only way to survive. Today felt like one of those times." I swallowed hard. There was a lump in my throat I couldn't quite move. "You know," I said softly, "for years I carried this pride for you, quietly. I didn't tell people because I was afraid they wouldn't see it, afraid they'd keep whispering no matter what I said. But tonight I want you to hear it straight from me. You are my son, not by chance, not by charity, by choice, by love, and nothing, no bloodline, no headline can change that." His lips trembled just slightly, and for the first time that day his eyes glistened. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. I needed to hear that. We sat in silence again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of shame or whispers. It was the kind of silence that holds words too sacred to be spoken twice. After a while, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Adopting me?" The question hit me like a stone I hadn't seen coming. I leaned forward too, my voice steady. "Never, not once. If anything, I regret not telling you more often how grateful I am that you're mine." His shoulders eased. A small smile crept across his face, tired but true. "You know," he said, "when those boys at school used to shove me around, call me names, I stayed quiet because I kept hearing your voice in my head, not telling me to fight back, just reminding me that being your son was enough. And tonight in that courtroom, I wasn't fighting for me, I was fighting for us." I closed my eyes for a moment because sometimes you need to hold tears where no one can see them fall. When I opened them again, he was watching me with that same steady gaze. "You saved us, son," I said quietly. "Not just our name, us." The clock ticked past midnight. The house was still. The storm outside our family had not fully passed, but in that living room on that quiet night, something shifted. I realized I no longer carried my pride in secret. It was no longer a flame tucked inside my chest. It burned in the open now, bright enough for him to see, bright enough to light whatever path lay ahead. Eventually he rose, stretched, and said good night. I stayed a while longer, staring at the framed photo on the mantel. the one I had taken years ago of him standing under the oak tree, half smiling in the shade. Only now, I understood what that photo had always been. Not the picture of a boy waiting at the edge, but the image of a man destined to stand in the center. And as I turned out the light and headed to bed, I whispered a prayer I had never prayed before. Thank you, God, for giving me not the son I expected, but the son we all needed. If you live long enough, you learn that people don't apologize the way they should. They don't sit across from you, look you in the eye, and say, I was wrong. No, most of the time, apologies come dressed in small talk, in hesitant smiles, in casseroles left at your door. That's how it started for us. A week after my son stood in that courtroom, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, there stood my cousin Martha, the same woman who, years ago, had whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, he's not really ours. She held a pie, apple with a lattice crust, the kind she used to boast about at reunions. I thought you might like this, she said, her eyes darting away from mine. I took it not for the pie, but for what it meant. She wasn't here to feed me. She was here to swallow her pride. And she wasn't the only one. In the days that followed, the phone calls multiplied. Aunts who once skipped over my boy in photographs now asked how he was doing. Uncles who had praised my real sons for their business acumen now spoke of how remarkable the youngest had turned out. Neighbors who used to give us pitying glances at church now smiled wide, their voices sweetened by something that almost sounded like respect. It was strange, almost dizzying, how quickly the wind changed direction. At first, I wanted to slam the door on all of it. I wanted to say, where were you when he was shoved on schoolyards? Where were you when you left him out of family photos? Where were you when your whispers cut him deeper than any blade? But then I looked at my son. He accepted their gestures with a quiet nod, never smug, never bitter. He shook hands. He thanked them. He smiled, though I could see it was the same rationed smile, careful not to give too much. One Sunday after service, an uncle approached him in the churchyard. Son, he said awkwardly, you did good, real good, your father must be proud. My boy only answered, thank you, sir. Sir, not uncle, and I realized something, forgiveness doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it simply means standing tall enough that their judgment no longer shrinks you. That evening we sat on the porch, the cicadas singing in the trees, the summer air heavy with the smell of honeysuckle. I asked him, does it feel good seeing them come around? He leaned back, hands folded behind his head. It feels different, but I'm not doing it for them, Dad. I never was. I just wanted to stand for what was right. If they see me now, that's fine. If they don't, well, I've lived without their approval this long. I nodded slowly. You're stronger than I ever was. He chuckled softly. No, Dad, I just had to learn it earlier. Those words stung because they were true. He had been forced into resilience by the very people who now wanted to claim him as their own. But here's the thing about tables turning. Sometimes they don't turn because people change. Sometimes they turn because the world finally shows them what they should have seen all along. And while part of me wanted to cling to anger, another part, maybe the better part, saw the gift in it. My son didn't need their apologies. He had already proven himself. But I, as his father, got to witness something rare. The boy once mocked, ignored, diminished, now being lifted up, even if belatedly, by the same mouths that once spat his name. One night, I pulled out the family photo from the reunion years ago, the one where he'd been left standing in the shade. I placed it beside the newspaper headline clipped to my corkboard. Side by side, absence and presence, silence and voice, exclusion and triumph. The contrast was almost too much to bear. The tables had turned, yes, but it wasn't because they pulled him in. It was because he had pushed his way into the light, not with force but with truth. And the truth has a way of rearranging seats at the table until even the proudest must bow their heads. That's when I knew the story wasn't done. The storm had shifted, but one more moment waited for us. A moment when all those whispers and stares would finally meet their reckoning. And my son, the one they once said wasn't ours, would have the last laugh. If you live long enough, you see truth walk into a room like sunlight through a dirty window. At first it's dim, hazy, fragile. But once it takes hold, nothing, no curtain, no shade, no whisper can keep it out. That was the day of the final verdict. The courtroom was packed tighter than I'd ever seen. Every pew filled, reporters lined the aisles, cameras waiting like vultures. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that makes your palms sweat no matter how many prayers you've said. I sat in the second row, my wife clutching my hand so hard I thought my fingers might snap. In front of us, my eldest son stared at the floor, his tie crooked, his jaw slack. For all his boasting years ago, his talk of carrying the family legacy, he now looked like a boy who had misplaced his crown. But beside me, my youngest stood tall, my adopted son. He wasn't the defendant, he wasn't even on trial, yet the eyes of the room kept drifting toward him. They'd seen his words, read his evidence, felt the quiet force of his presence. The whispers that once dismissed him as not really ours now carried a different edge. That's the one who saved them. That's the one who matters. The judge read the findings. His voice was steady, grave. Based on the evidence presented, it is the conclusion of this court that Robert Placeholder's surname had no direct involvement in the fraudulent activities of the company. His name is hereby cleared of all charges. The words landed like a hammer, the soundless kind of hammer, the one that doesn't make noise but cracks open something deep inside you. My wife sobbed. I bowed my head, whispering thanks I hadn't dared to form before. Reporters scrambled, pens scratching furiously. But I kept my eyes on him, my son. He didn't cheer. He didn't pump his fist. He simply closed his eyes, breathed in once, and exhaled as though releasing years of silence. When we walked out into the sun, the cameras exploded. Questions rained down. How does it feel to be vindicated? Do you have a statement for the public? What do you say to your critics? For a moment I thought about walking past, saying nothing. But then I felt his hand on my shoulder, my boy's hand, firm, steady. He gave me a look, one that said, "This is your moment, Dad." And so I stopped. I faced the cameras, the reporters, the relatives lingering at the edges. I spoke not just for myself, but for him, for all the years of whispers. My family's name was dragged through the mud, I said. And the one who lifted it out was not the sons you expected. It was the son you doubted, the one you whispered about, the one you left out of your pictures, my adopted son. The crowd hushed. I let the words hang there heavy before continuing. Blood does not make a family, love does. And today the world saw what I have known since the day I first held his hand. He is mine. He always was. He always will be. For the first time in my life, I saw reporters lower their cameras, not because the story was done, but because the truth didn't need a flashbulb to be seen. Later, at the family gathering that followed, the tables had turned fully. Those same aunts and uncles who once kept him at the edges now circled near, offering congratulations, trying to claim a piece of his light. But this time, it wasn't my son who stood in the shadows. It was them. He walked through the crowd with quiet grace, answering their praise with simple nods. No bitterness, no gloating, only dignity. And when the photographer called for a family picture, I waited. I wanted to see what they would do. This time, no one left him out. In fact, they pulled him to the center. He looked at me once, a flicker of a smile, and I nodded. Yes, stand there, where you belong. The shutter clicked. And for the first time, the picture told the truth. That night, when the relatives had gone and the house grew quiet again, I sat by the fireplace with him. "You know," I said, "they laughed once. They laughed because you were adopted." He tilted his head. "And now," I whispered, "the last laugh is yours, not because you embarrassed them, but because you proved what love can do." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. And as the embers glowed faintly, I realized the storm had passed. Not because the world had changed, but because my son had shown us how to stand in it. And that, I thought, was the greatest revenge of all. The house is quiet now, quieter than it has been in months. The storm has passed, the cameras have gone, the phones have stopped ringing. And here I sit in my old chair by the window, watching the evening light bend across the floorboards. My wife hums softly in the kitchen. My son, is out on the porch, sketching again, the way he always does when the world grows still. I think about all the rooms we've sat in together, The living room with its whispers, the church pew with its stairs, the schoolyard under the oak tree, the reunion where a photograph left him out. I think about the courtroom where his voice carried truth like a banner, about the headline that finally told the world what I had always known. And I think about you, yes, you listening to me now. You've walked with me through each of those rooms, through each silence, each stare, each crack in the foundation of what people call family. You've carried this story with me, and I can't thank you enough for that, because stories like mine, stories like his, aren't easy. They hurt in places you didn't know could ache, but they also heal. When I was a younger man, I used to believe family was something fixed, like a tree planted once and left to grow in one direction. Bloodlines, surnames, heritage, that was the soil. That was what determined who you were. But age teaches you different. Family isn't fixed. It's chosen, nurtured, defended. It's the boy who calls you dad, even when others remind him he doesn't have your blood. It's the child who stands in a courtroom to save a name that never truly saved him. It's love, plain and stubborn, that holds tighter than any DNA. And that's what I want you to take from my story. Not revenge in the bitter sense, not the satisfaction of proving others wrong, but the quiet revenge of proving love right. They laughed at my son because he was adopted. They whispered, excluded, doubted. And yet when the storm came, he was the only one who stood. He saved not just a name, but the truth of what family really is. So tonight, as I sit here in the dimming light, I feel something I didn't think I'd feel again. Peace. I look at him on the porch, his pencil moving across paper, the soft smile tugging at his lips. And I realize the last chapter of this story isn't written in newspapers or photographs. It's written here in our home, in the quiet bond between father and son. Before I close, I want to speak directly to you, the one who has listened, who has stayed with me through 12 chapters of whispers, storms, and truths. If you've ever felt left out, overlooked, or diminished because you didn't fit the way the world expected, remember my boy. Remember that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands quietly, waiting for its moment to rise. And if you've ever been the one doing the whispering, maybe doubting someone's worth because of how they came into a family, remember this. Love makes kin stronger than blood ever will. So thank you for listening, for walking beside me in this. I don't take your time or your heart lightly. If you found something in this story that touched you, I ask only this: carry it forward. Share it with someone who needs to know they belong, someone who needs to know that chosen love can save more than just a name, it can save a soul. And if you'd like, subscribe and stay with us here, because stories like this, stories of fathers, sons, daughters, families, don't end. They just take new shapes, and I'd be honored to share more of them with you. Until then, I wish you what I now hold in my heart: peace, strength, and the unshakable love of family. Take care of yourselves, and may God bless you and your loved ones with health, with hope, and with a love that doesn't whisper but declares itself boldly. From one father's heart to yours, thank you.